Well, as a vintage leadership, we want to, in the course of this year, walk through several different important topics that will grow us as leaders. And so for this month, one of the topics that we're going to be looking at, this today is part one, and then in a couple weeks we'll do part two, goal setting, productivity, and execution. One of the things that as we kind of transition from 2017 to 2018, one of the things that we noticed as pastors was that regardless of where you're at in leadership with Vintage Church, one of the things that you're processing and thinking about is productivity. And there always feels like there's more to do, there's too much to do, and there's never enough time, right? And there's a reality to that's in some sense always going to be true. But in the other sense, I think one of the things that we need to do as leaders is really process and think about how we can decrease that frustration in our lives. And there are things that we can do as leaders related to goal setting and productivity and execution that we can do that I think can help us and set us up to be more productive. And it's really not just about being more productive, but it's trying to accomplish the things that we believe God has set out for us as a church. And so it's not just about getting, hey, I'm going to get this work done in this amount of time. It's actually also more about, this is what God has called us to. And we want to see these things accomplished. And so how are we going to accomplish them, and in what amount of time are we going to be able to accomplish them in? And so as a leadership, we really want to walk through these things related to goal setting, productivity, and execution. I think some things just to kind of set the stage that are really important for us to kind of have in the back of our mind as we're thinking about these things are these things. Number one, we all want to be productive. I just kind of shared that. I mean, none of us, regardless of what we're doing, whether it's running errands one day, whether it's the work that we do here at Vintage Church, whether we have another job, whether it's our family, whatever it is, we all want to be productive. We don't want to waste time. We want to be efficient and be productive. Number two, the other thing that I believe and I hope is happening is that you all are dreaming big dreams for the kingdom of God. I believe that God wants us to dream, and he wants us to have God-sized dreams and visions for his kingdom, because God has those God-sized dreams and visions. And that's related to the importance of goal setting and productivity and those kinds of things. And so the question as we jump in is, how are we going to do that? How are we going to be able to discover those dreams and then also be able to accomplish those dreams? And so what I want to do today is really talk about two things: the rule of life, which for many of you is not new news, but today is going to be kind of more of a recap to kind of get you re-immersed into that and hopefully get you thinking about the rule of life again for this year and this season of life. And then number two, focus on goal setting. Focus on goal setting. And so those are going to be the first two things that we talk about in this session. So when we talk about a rule of life, one of the things to kind of introduce the idea of the rule of life, there was several years ago when I started doing the residency program that we have at Vintage Church, one of the things that I was processing and thinking about was, on a personal level, how do I begin to structure and think about my life? And that's not just thinking about it kind of in that productivity side of it, but it's also thinking about it on a spiritual side. There's so much kind of vying for our time, whether it's family, friends, work, whatever. How do I structure my life in such a way that I don't feel like my life is running me, but that I'm running my life? And so I was reading a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzaro. It's a book that we've kind of walked through in residency, that we walked through a little bit last year when we did the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality Equip series. And one of the things that he talked about in that book was developing a rule of life for yourself. And it's kind of a spiritual discipline, if you will. And then I found another book that even was more like a workbook that helped me understand how to actually develop a rule of life. And so this concept of a rule of life really comes from those two books. So what is a rule of life? Peter Scazzaro defines a rule of life like this, and I think it's the most basic, simple definition. It's an intentional, conscious plan to keep God at the center of everything we do. An intentional, conscious plan to keep God at the center of everything we do. And one of the things that he talks about in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and Emotionally Healthy Leader, is that here's the reality about life. Each and every one of us have a plan for our life. We all have a plan. The reality, though, is that that plan might not be intentional and it might not be conscious. And so you're just waking up, getting in the shower, getting in your car, running to work, doing your work, going home, going to bed. And you have put little to no thought into how your life is ordered. And so what Peter Scazzaro talks about is that we need to have an intentional, conscious plan. And regardless of what we're doing in the day, the focus of that plan should be able to keep, that we should be keeping God at the center of everything. So if we're spending time with our family, if we're at work, if we're having dinner with our friends, whatever it is, what are we doing that's going to help us keep God at the center of everything we do? So that's Peter Scazzaro's definition. The other book was called Crafting a Rule of Life by Stephen Macchia. And in that book, he defines a rule of life like this. It's a holistic description of the spirit-empowered rhythms and relationships that create, redeem, sustain, and transform the life God invites you to humbly fulfill for Christ's glory. So holistic, meaning all of life. And then I think the two things that we're going to kind of come back to that are very important are rhythms and relationships. And so as we think about that intentional conscious plan, we need to think about rhythms and relationships, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So a personal rule of life includes things, it's that holistic description. It's spirit empowered. This isn't something necessarily that we're going to do. It's what God is going to do. It includes rhythms and relationships, humbly fulfilled for Christ's glory. The focus and goal of why we're building a rule of life is not to be more productive, actually. It's for Christ's glory. And then lastly, it's best modeled by Jesus. Jesus intentionally lived his life with a plan. Now, before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of the rule of life, I think it's important just to briefly stop and say, why start here? Like, why not think about goals first? Like, maybe those goals are going to help define what our rule of life is going to look like, or that kind of thing. And I think it's important to start with the rule of life because it's the foundation that's going to drive the rest of your life. It's the foundation that's going to help you think about the goals that you might want to develop, the goals that you might want to have. If you don't have the rule of life, then you're not thinking about keeping God at the center of everything that you do. So in the goals that you're setting, or trying to be more productive, or trying to execute on things better, you might be trying to do those because of other things than wanting to keep God at the center of everything you do. And so I really see the rule of life as kind of that foundational building block that as a leader, we have to develop and create first. And if we start there, then we can begin to think more about goal setting, productivity, and execution. I also want to encourage you guys, if you remember, several years ago, we did an equip training on this. You can go to that equip training page under resources. And I talk about the rule of life a little bit and give a little more detail in the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality Equip series we did last January. And then also, if you go, we have audio of and worksheets and my notes of the entire night of Organizing Chaos. And all I did that night was just talk about the rule of life. And so we went into a lot of detail there, and you can go and find those. Resources online. So the reality about the rule of life are some of these things. Some of these we've already talked about, but I want to go over them again. Reality is this: we are all living our lives with the rule of life. It's just whether or not that rule of life is an intentional, conscious plan or not. Number two, most of us are like cars on autopilot, living functionally but not intentional lives. So we're doing things, we're getting things done, but at the end of the day, the life that we're developing and creating is functioning, but it's not intentional. And so if you're not being intentional with the kind of life that you want to live, you're not going to live that life. So that's part of the importance of the rule of life. So then it drives us to this question, how do we live intentional lives? How do we live intentional lives? And that's where we get to the next point, crafting a rule of life. All of this material in Crafting a Rule of Life comes from that book that I was just mentioning to you, Crafting a Rule of Life by Stephen Macchia. The first thing that he talks about in regards to crafting a rule of life, and I do think that these are fundamental questions, whether or not you actually go and craft a rule of life or not, these are fundamental questions that you need to answer for yourself because they're going to help govern and guide everything that you do. And so he kind of sets out, this is kind of in my mind pre-work to the rule of life. Before you can even really start thinking about crafting a rule of life, you have to think about these questions. Number one, this is framing your rule of life. Number one, what are my roles? So think about every single role that you have. And then I would encourage you to even begin to kind of rank and tier those roles. So I'm a Christian, right? That's not something that you should leave out. You should leave in and incorporate your role in the reality that you follow God. So I'm a Christian. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a pastor. I'm a teacher. Those are just some of my roles. I could include things like I'm a son. I'm a friend. But I'm prioritizing those 5 roles that I have. So you have to think about and define what are your roles. Number 2, what are your gifts? What are your gifts? Think about your gifts. And these could be natural gifts. Excuse me. These could be natural gifts, or these could be spiritual gifts. And so for me, one of the things that I've been gifted in is the ability to teach. And so that's a gift. Part of that gifting is being able to, having a desire and an aspiration to learn and the ability to learn, to have wisdom in those things and knowledge in those things. As you think about your gifts, that's going to help this kind of govern and guide potentially the direction of your life and where that intentional conscious plan is going to lead you. So what are my roles? What are my gifts? Number 3, what are my desires? Think about your own life. And I would encourage you to think about your desires in all of your roles. So don't just think about what are your desires for Vintage Church. Yes, that's important. You should do that. You should want to do that. But you need to think about your desires related to your family, related to, if you have kids, your children, related to work, related to church, related to any extracurricular activities that you have. What are those desires? And begin to list those things and think about those things. The last 2, I think, are kind of taking the roles, gifts, and desires and beginning to kind of encapsulate them in a vision and a mission. So what is the vision for my life and what is the mission for my life? A vision can be defined as your personal rule of life being discerned and framed within the holistic, long-term vision and passion God has planted in your heart. The long-term vision and passion God has planted in your heart. The mission is where your personal rule of life is discerned and framed within specific purposes that God has invited you to fulfill in this season of your life. So when I think about the vision for my life, what I think about is just this very basic, simple idea is that I want to love God so deeply that it compels other people to fall in love with him. That's kind of the vision that God has birthed in my heart for my life. Now, how do I live that out? What are the purposes? Well, then it goes down to, I'm sorry, I've got that Chris cough. Then it comes down to thinking about your roles. So for me, my mission, I want to love God, lead my family, equip my church, serve my city. I begin to think about all those roles I fulfill or that I'm in, and then my mission helps me think about how am I going to fulfill those different roles. So what are my roles? What are my gifts? What are my desires? What's the vision for my life? And what's the mission for my life? So we've talked about framing my rule of life. The next thing that we need to talk about is then taking all of that content and beginning to form my rule of life. And this is where what Stephen Mackey had talked about is so important when we begin to think about rhythms, when we begin to think about relationships, and we begin to think about priorities. And so I want to encourage you first, when you're forming your rule of life, to think about rhythms. What are things that happen for you or that need to happen for you on a daily basis? What are things that need to happen in your life on a weekly basis? What are things that need to happen on a monthly basis, seasonally or quarterly, and then yearly? Begin to think about those regular rhythms in your life. So one for me that is a very simple but important rhythm in my life is I need to go to the doctor yearly. So I keep that on my rule of life because one of my priorities is my physical health. And so I think about that. Versus on the flip side with physical health, one that has become an important priority for me in my physical health is exercise. So I don't do that daily, but I do it 4 days a week. And so I begin to think about those different rhythms in my life. So we think about our rhythms: daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, seasonally, and yearly, and then priorities. And priorities-wise, this is what Stephen Mackey talks about. He lists these priorities, and I don't think these are the only priorities, but these are important priorities. Spiritual priorities, relational priorities, physical priorities, material priorities, and then vocational or missional priorities. So as you think about your rhythms, think about these priorities. What are spiritual priorities you have? So maybe it's right now with us reading the F-260 plan. 5 days a week, I'm reading that plan. Or spiritual, I'm going to pray 3 times a week for a specific amount of time. Relational priorities, once a month or twice a month, I'm going to date my significant other. To monthly, I'm going to do this one activity every month because it kind of fills me up. So you begin to think about those priorities and you begin to decide, okay, how can I prioritize those priorities? And then how do I fit those into the rhythms of my life? And as you begin to do that, all along the way, as you think about these priorities, you're thinking about keeping God at the center of all of those things. So how can you keep God you need to think about this. How do you keep God at the center of your marriage? That's a priority that you have. So within your rhythms, how are you going to prioritize that in the rhythms of your life? And so that's kind of the basic framework of the rule of life. I want to talk to you just briefly before we get into setting goals, some lessons that I have learned from myself, but also for other people as we've walked through the rule of life that I think are really important. Number one, the rule of life is not to be legalistic or restrictive. Rather, it should be a guide based on the rhythms of your life where God can remain at the center of everything. And so there's this reality with the rule of life that you want to stretch yourself to a certain extent because you recognize that there are things in your life, things that aren't in your life maybe, that you need in your life. And so if you're struggling to read your Bible consistently, and you know in your rule of life, one of those priorities is a spiritual priority, and reading your Bible is important to that, you're going to have to stretch yourself a little bit to make that a priority. But the last thing that you should do is begin to lay on yourself all of these legalistic responsibilities to where all of a sudden your rule of life becomes a burden. The rule of life is simply a guide to help you along the way and help you keep those priorities. So don't necessarily make it something that's rigorous and binding and legalistic in your life, but something that's more of a guide and something that's more freeing. Number two, life comes and goes in seasons. Understand the season that you're living in. And so each and every one of us have different seasons of life. And so that will determine what you can do in your life and what you should put in your rule of life. And so one thing that I'm getting really excited about, it's a couple years away still, but when my daughter is in school, that means on a Friday, both my son and daughter are in school. That's like free date day with my wife. That's a different season. We're not there yet. But that's a different season, and that's going to change the way in which Rachel and I interact with one another. When Gabe started school last year, it changed some of the things. When I finished my PhD, that season of life changed. And so different seasons require adjustments on your rule of life. Number 3, nothing will change unless you create action steps. And I think this was the biggest thing that I learned after the first couple times doing a rule of life and walking people through. If you have all of these things that you want to do, and some of them on the rule of life you've never done before, and you just think by putting it on a piece of paper and putting it there as part of your rule of life, you're going to do it, chances are you're not going to do it because you've not created action steps to actually get yourself to do it. So if you don't read the Bible all that often and you want to start reading the Bible more, what are action steps that are going to help you get there? Maybe it's, I'm going to pick this Bible reading plan, or I'm doing the F260 plan, and then Monday through Friday I'm reading, and I'm reading at this particular time. If you don't have those action steps, you're probably not going to accomplish it. And so the same thing can be said for any priority or anything that we put within the rule of life. Lastly, this, constantly reassess your rule of life and then make adjustments accordingly. And so if you've never done a rule of life before and you have all of these high hopes and high expectations for yourself, and then 2 months in you recognize, wow, I didn't accomplish 75% of what I wanted to accomplish, you need to go back and reassess and not beat yourself up over it, but reassess and make adjustments. Or when that season of life changes, you need to go back and reassess and change your rule of life. And so I really encourage people that when you think about your rule of life, you need to think about changing it seasonally or quarterly, kind of going back and looking at it maybe spring, summer, and fall every year to figure out some adjustments that you want to make. Maybe that's based on your season of life, but also maybe that's based on something that you're learning about yourself as you've been going through your rule of life. So that's a lot about the rule of life, and that kind of sets that groundwork. I want to encourage you again, go to the Equip series page, and you're going to find a whole lot more content there about the rule of life. But I do want to encourage you. I think the rule of life part is the foundational part that you build there. And everything else that you're going to build upon is going to be built upon that rule of life. So that's the rule of life. The next thing that I want to talk about is setting goals. And honestly, a lot of what I've been learning regarding setting goals has a lot to do and has a lot to come from Michael Hyatt. He's a kind of like a leadership, productivity teacher. And so you can find a lot of his resources, his podcasts, and those kinds of things online. And I'm going to, at the back of some of your notes, you have some pages that I've printed off for you that we're going to kind of reference through these things. But one of the things that Michael Hyatt talks about is the importance of setting goals. It's the importance of setting goals. If you're not going to set a goal, you have no idea where you're going to go and get to, right? I mean, if you know you've got to go on a trip and you get in your car and you start driving, where are you going to drive to? You don't know. Unless you say, my goal is to get from here to that place. And so you've got to set that goal, and then you got to begin to think about other things. Well, how long do I want to take to get there, and when do I want to get there, and those sorts of things. And so if you have no destination for different things in life, you're never going to get anywhere. And so goals are incredibly important in our personal life, in our professional life, in our relationships. And so one of the things that I want to help you with today is begin to think about how we can set good goals and what good goals look like. So some of the things that Michael Hyatt talks about in regards to setting goals is number one, keep goals few in number. Keep goals few in number. And so one of the things that he talks about is realistically, in a year, you can really only have about 7 to 10 goals. 7 to 10 goals that you're going to actually be able to accomplish. Because chances are, if you have 15, 20, 25, 30, you're only going to get 7 to 10 of those actually accomplished, because you are a finite human being and you can only do so much. So keep goals few in number. One of the most important things that he talks about is keeping goals smarter. Now, some of you might have heard of SMART goals before, and he uses some of those things, some of those elements with this acronym, but he also brings in some other things that I think are really important. So what are smarter goals? Number one, they're specific. Identify exactly what you want to accomplish. So if I say I want to be healthier as a goal, that's really not all that specific. But if I say I want to lose 20 pounds, that's a little more specific. For me, one of my goals this year as a diabetic is I want to lower my A1C to 7. That's a very specific number, because every time I go to the doctor after I get blood work, they're going to tell me exactly what that number is. And I'm really hoping it's lower than 8, but Christmas was not good to me. Number 2, so it's specific. Number 2, measurable. You want to be able to quantify the result. So you want to make your goals measurable. And so if you're losing weight, you don't just say, I want to lose weight. So you don't even just say losing weight is a little more specific than getting healthy, but it's still not quantifiable. So if you say I weigh 200 pounds and I want to get to 180, well, then you're quantifying that and you're saying I want to lose 20 pounds. And so you're beginning to narrow that even more. Now that's a quantitative goal. I think you've got to think a little more outside of the box if you're going to try and do a qualitative goal, right? The difference between quantitative and qualitative. Qualitative being something you can't necessarily measure. Now, sometimes you can make qualitative goals quantitative, and so one of my goals in 2018 is to put together a doesn't sound all that romantic, but it is a dating plan for Rachel and I. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is go on dates twice a month with her. There's a qualitative goal in that, to deepen my relationship with my wife. I'm quantifying it because I know if we go on dates together, we're going to spend more time together. But it has a qualitative ending to it. So you want them to be specific, you want them to be measurable, you want them to be actionable. And what Michael Hyatt means by that is don't use like be verbs. Use strong action verbs. So when I was talking about my A1C, it's lower my A1C. Or if it's something else, like a plan that I'm wanting to create, it's develop and implement this. So it's beginning to think about what's that action that you're going to take. Number 4, they're realistic. You need to recognize and implement the power of incremental change over time. And so, if you're 300 pounds and you're planning on wanting to get down to 200, is it realistic for you to lose 100 pounds in 1 year? Maybe not. It wouldn't be for me. And so you've got to think about what that looks like. It wouldn't be realistic for Rachel and I to say, hey, we're going to go on a date 3 days a week. That's not realistic for our time, for our money, a multitude of different things. So what's realistic? Number 5, that it's time bound. So you want to set a specific deadline. And this is just the reality that when you set a goal and you make it time bound, you put yourself within a parameter that you've got to take action to make this happen, to see it happen over a certain amount of time. So you want to bind yourself within a certain amount of time. But I also think part of that being realistic is like, what can you actually accomplish in X amount of time? It might be a full year. It might be a quarter. It might be 6 months. But beginning to think about those in time-bound deadlines. Number 6, exciting. If this is a goal that doesn't excite you, chances are you're not going to do anything about it. So some of you aren't excited about reading 48 books this year. I am. But that's exciting to me. So it needs to be exciting. And then last, relevant. I've read 2 books already this year. You want to make it number 7. You want to make it relevant. Make it appropriate to your season of life. And so, certain goals I'm not going to be able to have. I can't be a millionaire yet because I have 2 children, and they break me. My daughter still wears diapers and pull-ups. She breaks me. And so that needs to be relevant, right? There were certain things when I was when I was writing my dissertation and finishing the PhD program, there were certain goals that I couldn't have because I was focused on that. Now that I'm not doing that anymore, I can have different goals. And so different seasons of life bring about different relevant goals in life. So those are what a smarter goal looks like. Something that's specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, time-bound, exciting, and relevant. 3 other things on setting goals. Write them down. Write them down. So one of the things that Michael Hyatt talks about when he talks about goal setting that is in some sense contrary to what a lot of people are saying and doing right now is that the worst thing that you can do in setting goals is use electronic devices. That's the worst? That's one of the worst things that you can do. Because there's something that happens mentally when you actually write the goals down on paper. So he talks about writing those goals down. Number 4, review them frequently. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit with different types of goals, but whatever frequently looks like for you, you need to review them frequently and regularly. And I think this is one that I hadn't really thought about that I think is very important. Share them selectively. So one of the things that he talks about is you're going to set goals, and you don't need to tell everybody about these goals. And there's probably goals that you're going to set within your life that are going to be for a certain group of people, and those goals you're going to tell them. So like there are goals that I have for my family and for my wife that honestly I might not tell you guys, but Rachel and I are talking about them. But then there are goals that I'm setting for Vintage that I might not talk about with Rachel, that I'm talking about with you guys, but I'm not sharing with the entire church. And part of that is not everybody needs to know those goals, but also there's a level, when you share with a few people, there's a level of accountability where you're beginning to hold each other accountable in regards to those things. So with lowering my A1C this year, you guys know that now. If you see me in the kitchen every week eating cookies and drinking a Diet Coke, you could say something to me because that's not going to help me in the long run. But a Diet Coke here and there is not bad for you, just by the way. So how do you set goals? Keep goals few in number, make them smarter, write them down, review them frequently, share them selectively. So as we kind of wrap up a little bit, I want you to look at that next point, types of goals. And I want you to, so under my notes there, you have several different printouts. Go ahead and look at the first 4. Don't worry about, hold on to your ideal week, weekly review, weekend optimizer. We're going to talk about those next time. So I've given those to you. Number 1, I've given those to you, means you don't lose them. I've also hole punched everything for you so you can put it in a binder and keep it, okay? So what I want us to look at in particular is these top 4 sheets. One of the things that Michael Hyatt talks about. So this is something that I found. This is something that I found at the end of 2017, and I purchased it. It's called a full focus planner. Michael Hyatt's making a lot of money off of these. They're like $37 a quarter. This is just for quarter 1. Just quarter 1. Now you can do a full year subscription and save like $30. But all of these resources are PDFs that he sent. So when you buy this, you get some PDFs to look at, and then you get those tutorial videos. So at the end of my notes there, you see those resources. You can go to those links and pull up some of these resources. And just in those tutorial videos are actually some really good productivity, goal setting kind of teachings that he kind of talks about as he's explaining the planner. And so, one of the reasons I want to share some of these things with you is I think that these are really valuable tools that I've begun to use that I think could really help you. And so these PDFs kind of tease it out for you a little bit. And if you think this is something that could be a really great help for you, well, then you now can go and you can purchase it for yourself. So Michael Hyatt really talks about these three types of goals: annual goals, weekly big three goals, and the daily big three goals. So look at the first sheet there. My annual goals. This is what I was telling you about. My annual goals, 1 to 10. No more than 10. 10 things that you're going to work on this year. Maybe less. But what are 7 to 10 goals that you're setting for yourself in 2018? Okay? Now, hold on to that page. We're going to kind of come back to that. Look at the next page. Now, one of the cool things about the Full Focus Planner and what Michael Hyatt talks about is he doesn't just have you set these goals and say, okay, that's it, now figure it out. But he actually gives you these sheets that are right after the 10 goals that you can begin to lay out these goals with. Now, this isn't just, this is a good tool, and I think you should take it and use it, but I actually think some of the things that he talks about in regards to setting goals will help you achieve some of your goals. So he tells you to set these goals, and then he wants you to think about things like this. What domain is that goal in? So this is where not all of your goals should be about vintage. Like, start writing, what are some spiritual goals? One of the goals that I have in 2018 is developing a discipleship plan for my family, for my wife and for my kids. Spiritual plans, or spiritual domain, parental domain, intellectual, social, emotional, vocational, physical, marital, financial. The avocational are like hobbies or things like that you might have. And so you write that goal. Where does that goal fit in that domain? Then there are two types of goals that he talks about. A achievement goal, and that's really simple. Like, it's the losing weight goal, right? I want to lose 20 pounds. That's an achievement goal. But then there's also the habit goal. What's a new habit you're wanting to create in your life? So let's say you haven't read the Bible consistently ever. And you're saying in 2018, I want to start reading the Bible in a consistent way. That's a habit goal. So that would fit under the spiritual domain. It's a habit goal. If you look to the right of that, he also makes you think about these in quarters. So this is where you're working to make your goals time-bound. This might be a year-long goal that you have. So maybe it's quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. But maybe you think this is a goal that you can create and implement and achieve in quarter 1. Well, then you can check that and think about that. So it helps you give a time domain on it. The next two, motivations and reward. So why do you want to do this? The motivations element, I think, helps you think about how this is exciting to you. And it gets you back to reminding yourself why you're doing this. So, like, for instance, when I wrote down my goal for lowering my A1C, I said, these are three motivations, key motivations that are going to keep me going. Longer life with my family and friends, feeling better about myself, and having more energy. So when I feel like eating a whole sleeve of cookies, I can go back to those key motivations and remind myself that these three motivations are more important than that sleeve of cookies. So key motivations. Reward, one of the things that Michael Hyatt talks about is you set these goals, then you got to find a way, how are you going to reward yourself for achieving the goal? So if you're setting a personal goal for yourself, like let's say you do want to lose weight. Well, maybe a reward is I'm going to go out and get a new outfit, like a new suit or a new shirt or new pants or whatever. That's a reward because you've lost that weight. Now you can do that. Maybe you're trying to do something, you have a goal with your kids, and your kids want this certain toy. Well, if they achieve that goal, they get that toy. So you begin to build in intrinsic rewards for the goals that you're trying to set. And then the most important thing that I think he talks about that's very important for these annual goals are next steps. What are next steps that you have to take to see these goals play out and to achieve these goals? So you begin to think about what are those next steps. So when I thought about, I'll give you for instance again, my A1C, lowering my A1C, next steps. I needed to schedule a doctor and an eye visit because I need to go to the doctor, get my blood checked, how's my A1C. I'm supposed to do an eye visit every year because that's the number one way they determine how your diabetes is. Second next step, I need to continue to exercise 4 times per week. Number 3, this is one I'm working on, eat smaller portions. I need to do that. 4, I need to eat healthy snacks between meals. 5, I need to not eat after 7 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. And then 6, I need to eat healthier foods. Now, those are kind of general next steps, but then as you see, we're going to see how some of those next steps kind of become smaller next steps. So that's the annual goal. So you put your annual goals here, and then you begin to lay them out and explain them on this. The next thing that Michael Hyatt does, I think, is really good to help us set goals is this weekly big 3. So that's, I think, page 3 maybe that I gave you guys. And this is where you're beginning to break down these 10 goals that you've set into what are you going to do this week to begin to achieve those goals. So and this is what you're doing. You're taking some of those next steps and you're beginning to lay those out into very doable, manageable portions. And so every week you're looking at this and trying to figure out, okay, this is that big annual goal. What do I need to do this week to begin to achieve that goal? And so that's literally all you're doing. What must I accomplish this week to reach that goal? And that's also where you need to think about your annual goals and think about what quarter they fall into. Because if you have a goal that you think you're not going to get to till quarter 3 or quarter 4, chances are in your weekly big 3, you're not going to necessarily do a lot with those in January yet. But if you have a quarter 1 goal, that's probably going to be the focus of some of these weekly big 3s. So that's something there. And then the last thing that I want to talk with you about is these daily big 3. So you can look at that last page. Now, we're not going to look at all of this page today because next time that we talk, we're going to look at some of these other elements. But so you've got these annual goals, then you've got the weekly big 3, and then he makes you boil some of these goals down even more into the daily big 3. And so this isn't all related to some of those annual goals, but in your week on particular days, there's a good chance that some of those daily big 3 things are going to be related to achieving those annual goals that you have. So I would encourage you to think about it like this. You have the big annual goal. You're kind of narrowing in, these are my weekly big 3. And then, 2 to 3 days a week, part of your daily big 3 is creating even smaller next steps that are going to help you get back to achieving that annual goal. And so sometimes the daily big 3, you're not going to do anything for your annual goal. Like today is mostly meetings for me. So these meetings are not necessarily, they're important. That's why they're a part of my daily big 3, but they're not getting to my annual goals. But this week on Wednesday and Thursday, I'm doing things that are a part of those daily big 3 that are going to get to my weekly big 3 that are going to get to my annual big 3. And I'm slowly kind of chunking away at those goals to hopefully achieve those goals. Does all that make sense? So there you have kind of the beginning steps of thinking about hopefully your rule of life. And again, a lot of that material is not necessarily new for you there, but also beginning to think about goal setting. And I don't know, for at least I'll share this with you guys on my perspective. I don't think I've thought about goals nearly as much as he's encouraging and challenging us to do as leaders before. And I think perhaps some of the frustrations and challenges that we have in our personal life, but also in our ministry, is because we're not setting good goals. And because we're not setting good goals, we're not being productive with our time. And because we're not setting good goals, we're not actually executing like we need to, because we don't know what to execute on. And so as we begin to set good goals and make good next steps, I think that's going to help us be productive with our time, and it's going to challenge us to think about what execution actually looks like. Then we can actually go back at the end of whatever that time frame is and actually look at those goals and say, I don't know if whether you've achieved that goal or not. Maybe that goal was too big, too small, and because you've actually done a good job of setting goals, you can actually measure whether or not that was a good goal, that was an achievable goal, or whether that was a pie in the sky, big dream that should have been narrowed down to a smaller goal over time. And so I think this kind of stuff is really going to help us in 2018 and beyond.